At dawn, the land between two rivers exhales. A thin veil of light spreads across the plains of southern Mesopotamia, touching broken walls and weathered foundations with a pale gold glow. The wind moves softly over the ruins, carrying grains of sand through streets that once bore the weight of merchants, priests, and kings. Beneath this quiet sky lie the remains of the cities of Sumer, Uruk, Eridu, places long reduced to fragments of mud brick in memory. Here, nearly 5,000 years ago, humanity carved symbols into clay and called it writing. Here, history is said to begin. But what if history did not begin here at all? The first written civilization left behind more than administrative records and temple hymns. Pressed into clay tablets in the intricate wedges of cuneiform are stories, origin stories, that speak of beings not entirely human, of ages that stretch beyond conventional chronologies, of rulers whose reigns lasted not decades but tens of thousands of years. These texts, copied and recopied across generations, preserved something older than the cities themselves. A memory. Scholars have long studied the myths of Sumer as theology, as poetry, as metaphor. They tell of the Anunnaki, powerful entities who shaped destinies and governed cosmic order. They describe a time before the flood, when kingship descended from the heavens and established itself in Eridu. The Sumerian king list records antediluvian rulers with reigns that defy modern comprehension, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. Numbers so vast they strain belief. Most interpret these figures symbolically, reflections of divine authority rather than literal chronology. Yet even as metaphor, the scale of these accounts demands attention. Why would the earliest scribes, meticulous record keepers of grain and trade, preserve such extravagant timelines? Why root their political legitimacy in a distant, almost alien antiquity? In the epic traditions that would later echo through Akkadian and Babylonian literature, we encounter figures like Adapa, a sage fashioned by the god Enki, endowed with wisdom but denied immortality. We read of Apkallu, 7 primordial sages, described in later Mesopotamian sources as beings of extraordinary knowledge who emerged from the sea to instruct humanity in the arts of civilization. In some depictions they are not entirely human. Cloaked in fish skins associated with the abyss, they stand at the threshold between worlds. To the modern eye, such imagery is mythic language, the symbolic clothing of cultural memory. Yet the persistence of these motifs across centuries suggests something more enduring than simple invention. Again and again the texts return to the notion that before ordinary humans ruled the earth, there existed another order of being, wiser, longer-lived, closer to the divine. The forbidden question stirs in the silence of these ruins. What if these accounts preserve not merely spiritual allegory, but a distant recollection of a different kind of humanity? Anthropology tells us that Homo sapiens emerged roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa. Archaeology maps the slow spread of our species across continents, the development of tools, art, and eventually agriculture. For tens of millennia, we lived as hunter-gatherers, leaving behind cave paintings and stone blades. Civilization, cities, writing, monumental architecture, appears only in the last fraction of our existence. But the human story is not solitary. The fossil record reveals that we were once accompanied by other hominins, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in the East, and perhaps others whose traces are faint but real. Genetic evidence confirms that these lineages interbred with our own. For a time, the Earth was shared by multiple human species. Most of them vanished. Their disappearance is a subject of ongoing debate: climate shifts, competition, assimilation. Whatever the cause, their physical remains endure only as fragments of bone and strands of DNA woven into our genomes. They left no written testimony, no tablets, no monuments bearing their names. And yet, in the earliest written records of Sumer, there lingers a suggestion of predecessors, beings who taught, who ruled, who existed before the Great Flood reset the world. The flood itself, described in the Epic of Ziusudra and echoed later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, functions as a dividing line between epochs. Before it, impossibly ancient kings. After it, reigns measured in plausible centuries. It is tempting to dismiss these elements as mythic exaggeration, as the natural inflation of memory over time. Certainly, no archaeological evidence confirms the existence of a lost advanced civilization predating Sumer by tens of thousands of years. No skeletal remains point to a forgotten humanoid species with cities and scribes. And yet the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The archaeological record is incomplete, vulnerable to erosion, submersion, and the relentless transformations of geology. Entire coastlines that existed at the end of the last ice age now lie beneath rising seas. Vast stretches of prehistoric habitation remain unexplored. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to invent civilization from nothing. They wrote as inheritors. Kingship was lowered from heaven. Knowledge was transmitted. The Apkallu instructed humanity in writing, architecture, ritual. In later Mesopotamian art, these figures are often rendered with hybrid features. Human bodies, fish cloaks, sometimes wings, visual metaphors perhaps for liminality. Or perhaps distorted memories of something once encountered and imperfectly understood. The mind resists such speculation. It seeks firm ground, measurable data, carbon dates and stratified layers. And rightly so. Serious inquiry demands discipline. But intellectual seriousness also requires that we examine why certain patterns persist across cultures and centuries. Why do so many origin myths speak of earlier beings, of teachers who arrived at the dawn of awareness? Why do the earliest written texts frame humanity not as the beginning, but as the inheritor of a deeper past? Here, in the wind-swept remains of Sumer, the question refuses to settle. Clay tablets unearthed from the libraries of ancient cities are fragile, yet they endure. Pressed into their surfaces are wedges that outlived empires. The scribes who shaped them could not have imagined modern archaeologists brushing away sand to read their words. They wrote for gods and kings, for posterity as they understood it. If within those lines lies a memory, distorted, mythologized but rooted in lived experience, it would not announce itself plainly. It would be veiled in cosmology, encoded in numbers, hidden behind the language of divinity. The ancient mind did not separate the sacred from the historical as we do. For them, to speak of gods was to speak of origins. The dawn grows brighter over Mesopotamia. The shadows retreat from broken ziggurats and collapsed walls. What appears at first as silence is, on closer listening, filled with echoes, fragments of stories pressed into clay, carried across millennia. What if the first civilization did not merely record its own beginnings, but safeguarded the fading memory of a humanoid species that came before us? A lineage now extinct, absorbed, or erased by catastrophe and time. The ruins offer no immediate answer. They offer only the question buried in sand, waiting to be unearthed. Long before empires stretched across continents, before Rome rose from its hills or Egypt crowned its pharaohs in stone, there was a low, fertile plain between two restless rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates descended from distant highlands and spilled into the alluvial heart of southern Mesopotamia, depositing silt, nourishing reeds, and shaping a landscape both generous and unforgiving. It was here, in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, that something unprecedented began. The people who would later be called Sumerians did not leave us a clear account of their origins. Their language appears in history already formed, unrelated to known linguistic families. Their cities emerge from layers of earlier settlements, growing from villages into dense urban centers with temples, workshops, and defensive walls. By 3500 BCE, places such as Uruk had become true cities, not merely clusters of dwellings, but organized environments with hierarchy, labor specialization, and monumental architecture. Uruk's temple precinct rose above the plain, its platforms and whitewashed walls visible from afar. Around it moved priests, administrators, craftsmen, farmers, and traders. Grain was cultivated in irrigated fields, sheep and goats were herded across open ground. Trade routes extended outward, carrying obsidian, timber, and precious stones into a land poor in natural resources but rich in ingenuity. From this complexity arose a new necessity: record-keeping. At first, small clay tokens represented measures of grain or livestock. Over time, these tokens were impressed onto clay envelopes, and eventually the impressions were made directly onto flat tablets. By around 3200 BCE, the impressions evolved into abstract signs. A stylus, cut from reed, pressed wedge-shaped marks into damp clay. The result was cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. These tablets are among the earliest surviving written records in human history. They are not myths carved in stone to inspire awe. Many are humble, practical, almost mundane. Lists of rations, inventories of livestock, records of labor, contracts sealed in clay. They speak of barley distributed to workers, of beer allotted to temple staff, of debts owed and repaid. Their concerns are immediate, material, administrative. It is precisely this ordinariness that makes them extraordinary. Unlike oral tradition which shifts with each retelling, these marks endure. Fired accidentally in ancient conflagrations or deliberately baked for permanence, thousands of tablets have survived the collapse of the cities that produced them. Buried beneath layers of earth, they waited for millennia until archaeologists uncovered them in the 19th and 20th centuries. When deciphered, they revealed voices from the dawn of recorded time. Writing did not emerge as poetry. It emerged as accountability. And yet, within a few centuries, the system expanded. The signs multiplied. They came to represent not only commodities but sounds, syllables, and ideas. Language itself was captured in clay. Through this innovation, Sumerian scribes began to record hymns to their gods, proverbs, incantations, royal inscriptions, and narratives that reached far beyond the counting of grain. The birth of writing marks a threshold in human consciousness. With it came the ability to externalize memory, to fix thought outside the fragile vessel of the mind. A king's decree could outlive his reign. A hymn could echo across generations. A story could survive the death of its teller. Kingship, too, took on new dimensions. Power in Sumer was not merely physical dominance. It was sanctified through ritual and inscription. Rulers commissioned texts to legitimize their authority, to proclaim that they had been chosen by the gods, that they had built temples and secured prosperity. The city was both political and sacred space, its heart beating in rhythm with the divine. Among the most enigmatic documents recovered from this era is the Sumerian King List, a text that attempts to catalog rulers from a time before the flood to historical dynasties recognizable through archaeology. The list blends plausibility with impossibility. Early kings are said to have reigned for thousands of years. Later rulers occupy spans more consistent with human lifetimes. Most scholars interpret the exaggerated reigns as symbolic, expressions of grandeur or theological framing rather than literal chronology. Yet the text itself does not distinguish between legend and record. It presents a continuum, a line of kingship stretching backward into a deep and shadowed past. This is why the tablets must be taken seriously. They are not casual folklore scribbled in isolation. They are products of an organized scribal culture, trained in schools, bound by conventions and preserved in archives. Scribes copied earlier texts with care, sometimes noting that a tablet was a faithful reproduction of an older original. The existence of libraries, such as those later assembled in Mesopotamian cities, attests to a reverence for preservation. When these early records speak of origins, of floods, of primordial rulers or semi-divine sages, they do so within a framework that also records taxes and trade. The same system that tracked sheep and barley transmitted cosmology and kingship. To dismiss one entirely while accepting the other without question would be an oversimplification. Archaeology confirms much of what the tablets describe. The cities existed. The temples stood. Irrigation networks sustained dense populations in a challenging environment. The stratified layers of ruins align with shifting dynasties and periods of upheaval. The material culture corresponds with the administrative records. And yet, beyond the verified layers lies a region of uncertainty. The earliest tablets appear already sophisticated. Writing seems to emerge not as a crude experiment but as a system capable of adaptation and expansion. How long did its precursors exist before surviving examples were preserved? How many earlier tablets dissolved back into mud, their messages lost forever? The archaeological record is fragmentary by nature. Entire chapters of human development may have vanished in floods, fires, or the slow churn of the earth. The Sumerians themselves were conscious of antiquity. They restored older temples, claiming to rebuild foundations laid by distant ancestors. Inscriptions speak of cities that had existed long before the reigning king, of shrines established in remote ages. There is a sense, embedded in their texts, that they were heirs to something already ancient. The first voices of civilization do not shout. They murmur from clay, restrained and deliberate. They speak of order wrested from chaos, of rivers controlled through canals, of society organized through law and ritual. They reveal a people who understood the fragility of memory and sought to anchor it in something enduring. When we read these tablets today, we encounter not only data but intention. Someone pressed those wedges into wet clay with purpose. Someone believed that what was being recorded mattered enough to preserve. Civilization, in this sense, is not merely the construction of cities. It is the decision to remember. And so the earliest surviving records demand attention, not because they confirm every detail they contain, but because they represent the first sustained attempt to fix human experience in durable form. Within them lie the seeds of history, myth, governance, and identity. In the shifting light of Mesopotamia's plains, the broken outlines of ancient cities still mark where writing first took root. Beneath the dust, more tablets remain undiscovered, their surfaces silent but intact. The first voices of civilization have spoken, yet what they carry from the depths of their past may extend further than we have yet understood. In the 19th century, as European empires pushed their influence across the Near East, Another conquest quietly unfolded beneath the soil of Mesopotamia. It was not waged with rifles or banners, but with picks, brushes, and patient hands. Mounds that had long been dismissed as natural hills were revealed to be something else. The accumulated remains of cities, layered one upon another, rising like earthen tombs above the plain. At sites such as Nineveh, Nippur, and Ur, excavators began to uncover fragments of a forgotten world. Walls emerged. Statues surfaced. And then, in astonishing numbers, tablets appeared, small, unassuming rectangles of clay incised with wedge-shaped marks. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Entire archives sealed by time. Many were administrative, their surfaces dense with accounts and transactions. Others were hymns, incantations, legal codes. As scholars labored to decipher the script, a task that would take decades, a new chapter of human history slowly came into focus. The earliest known writing was no longer an abstraction. It could be read. But among the ledgers and liturgies were texts that unsettled expectation. One such document, reconstructed from fragments found at different sites, would come to be known as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it appeared straightforward, a chronological sequence of rulers and cities, tracing the transfer of kingship from one center to another. It named places already known from archaeology, Kish, Uruk, Ur. It described dynasties that corresponded, in part, to layers of material culture beneath the soil. Yet at its beginning, the list ventured into territory that strained credibility. It opened with a declaration that kingship had descended from heaven. It then named the first city to receive it, Eridu. What followed was a roster of antediluvian kings, rulers who reigned not for years, but for spans that defied human biology. One king was said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Another for 36,000. 8 kings in total presided before a great flood swept over the land. After the flood, the list continued. Kingship was lowered once more, this time to Kish. The reign lengths gradually diminished. Thousands of years gave way to centuries, and eventually to durations that align more closely with what is possible for human lifetimes. The text flowed from impossibility into plausibility without commentary, as if no boundary separated myth from record. When these figures were first translated, they provoked disbelief. Scholars questioned whether the numbers had been misread. Were they symbolic? Scribal errors? A numerical system misunderstood? Mesopotamian mathematics was sophisticated, based on a sexagesimal system that allowed for large calculations. Exaggeration in ancient royal inscriptions was not uncommon. And yet the pattern was consistent. Multiple copies of the king list, discovered in different contexts, preserved similar sequences and astonishingly long reigns before the flood. The numbers were not random scribbles. They followed internal logic, often expressed in units that suggest deliberate calculation rather than careless invention. The flood itself was not unique to the king list. Other Mesopotamian texts spoke of a catastrophic deluge that destroyed early humanity. In the Sumerian flood story, the gods resolved to send waters to wipe out mankind, only for a single righteous figure to be warned and saved. Later, in Akkadian tradition, this narrative would evolve into the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim recounts surviving a divine inundation. For generations, these accounts were considered purely mythological, moral tales wrapped in cosmic drama. But as geological studies advanced, evidence emerged that the Mesopotamian plain had indeed experienced severe flooding events in antiquity. River systems are volatile. Settlements built on low ground are vulnerable. Could memories of real catastrophes have been preserved and magnified over time? The question lingers: why situate impossibly long-lived kings before such a flood? If the pre-Diluvian rains are symbolic, what do they symbolize? Some propose that they represent astronomical cycles, encoded in narrative form. Others suggest that early dynasties sought to anchor their legitimacy in a sacred antiquity, extending their lineage into a mythic age beyond scrutiny. To claim descent from rulers who governed for tens of thousands of years was to assert divine sanction. Yet even as metaphor, the numbers are extreme. They stretch beyond mere hyperbole into a realm that feels almost alien. The antediluvian kings are not simply great, they belong to a different order of time. Excavations continued. At Nippur, a major religious center, tablets were found in temple libraries, carefully stored and catalogued. Some were copies of older compositions, suggesting that scribes intentionally preserved ancient traditions. The act of copying implies reverence. These were not idle stories but texts deemed worthy of transmission. As more tablets were deciphered, a pattern emerged. References to a primordial era appeared in multiple genres: hymns, incantations, royal inscriptions. There were mentions of sages who lived before the flood, of beings associated with divine wisdom, of a time when the boundary between human and divine seemed less fixed. The 19th century, confident in its linear vision of progress, struggled to reconcile these revelations. Here was evidence that the earliest literate society placed its origins in a past far deeper and stranger than previously imagined. The clay tablets did not conform neatly to the emerging frameworks of biblical chronology or Enlightenment rationalism. They demanded reinterpretation. Some dismissed the anomalies as myth layered over history, no more significant than Greek tales of gods and titans. Others sensed that something more complex was at play, not proof of literal millennia-long reigns, but an encoded memory of transition, of rupture. The flood divides the king list like a fault line. Before it, kings whose lifespans dwarf comprehension. After it, a gradual return to the scale of ordinary humanity. It is as though the text preserves the memory of two different worlds separated by catastrophe. Archaeology has not uncovered skeletal remains of humans who lived for thousands of years. No physical evidence confirms the literal existence of such antediluvian monarchs. Yet absence of evidence does not dissolve the text itself. The king list exists. Its numbers are written plainly. Its narrative was preserved with care. The clay tablets, once dismissed as relics of a primitive culture, have become foundational to our understanding of early civilization. They are studied with rigor, their language parsed, their context examined. And still, within their ordered columns, anomalies remain. There is something unsettling about holding a tablet inscribed more than 4,000 years ago and reading of a king who ruled for 36 millennia. The mind recoils, then recalibrates, searching for explanation. Symbol. Allegory. Political theology. But beneath these interpretive layers lies a quieter possibility, that the earliest historians of humanity remembered a time they could no longer fully comprehend. A time refracted through myth, distorted by the passage of generations, yet persistent enough to be written down. The tablets were never meant to be found by us. They were administrative tools, ritual texts, instruments of continuity for a living culture. That they survived at all is an accident of fire and earth. That they speak of a world before a great flood, ruled by beings whose reigns eclipse human lifespan, is not an accident. They endure, silent but insistent, asking whether the boundary between legend and history is as stable as we assume. The text does not hesitate. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. With that single line, the Sumerian king list establishes a premise that reverberates across millennia. Kingship is not portrayed as a human invention, not as a gradual evolution of tribal leadership into monarchy. It is something bestowed, lowered, transferred from a realm above to the earth below. Before it descends, there is silence. The cities named in the earliest portion of the list, Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larak, Sapar, Shurapak, are not imaginary landscapes. Archaeology has confirmed several of them as real settlements in southern Mesopotamia, their remains layered beneath centuries of habitation. Eridu in particular stands among the oldest known temple sites in the region, its sacred precinct rebuilt again and again atop earlier foundations, as if each generation felt compelled to anchor itself to an even deeper past. Yet the rulers associated with these cities before the flood are unlike any historical kings that followed. Alulim of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Alaungar for 36,000. The pattern continues through successive cities, each entrusted with kingship for spans that stretch across what, in modern reckoning, would be entire epochs. 8 kings. 5 cities. A total of 241,200 years before the deluge erased them. The numbers are precise, not vague. They are recorded in units of the Sumerian numerical system, calculated in multiples of 60. They suggest order, structure, intent. To modern sensibilities, such durations are impossible. No human organism could endure for even a fraction of those spans. The immediate conclusion is allegory, symbolic time, theological grandeur expressed through vast arithmetic. Ancient cultures often expanded lifespans to convey proximity to the divine. In later traditions, patriarchs lived for centuries before longevity contracts to familiar limits. And yet, here the contraction is abrupt. After the flood, reigns shortened dramatically. Kings still rule for decades, occasionally for over a century, but they no longer inhabit mythic time. The world has changed. Something has been reset. Why draw such a sharp boundary? If the antediluvian section were pure fantasy, why integrate it seamlessly into a list that otherwise aligns, at least in part, with archaeological strata and corroborated dynasties? Why preserve a chronology that begins in impossibility and transitions into history without commentary or explanation? Some scholars argue that the early reigns encode astronomical or calendrical cycles. The immense numbers may reflect cosmic order rather than literal years. In this view, the antediluvian kings are personifications of epochs, their reigns symbolic markers of time's vastness before a pivotal catastrophe. The descent of kingship from heaven could represent the institutionalization of political power, retroactively sanctified. Others suggest that the list reflects an attempt by later dynasties to legitimize themselves by tracing authority back to an imagined golden age. By claiming continuity with rulers who governed for tens of thousands of years, they embedded their power within sacred antiquity. Both explanations carry weight. Both preserve the integrity of the archaeological record. And yet the phrasing persists. Kingship descended from heaven. The text does not describe the evolution of governance from village councils or clan elders. It does not narrate a gradual accumulation of human authority. Instead, it frames rulership as something external to humanity, arriving from elsewhere. In the broader Mesopotamian corpus, this motif repeats. The Apkallu, the primordial sages, are described in later tradition as figures who lived before the flood, serving as advisors to the earliest kings. In some depictions they are not entirely human, associated with the deep waters of the Apsu, cloaked in fish skins, embodiments of wisdom that precedes ordinary civilization. If taken symbolically, they represent knowledge emerging from the unknown, culture rising from chaos. But if read as memory refracted through myth, they hint at intermediaries, beings who bridged realms, who stood at the threshold between divine and mortal. It is here that the mystery deepens. The archaeological record confirms that anatomically modern humans lived in Mesopotamia long before the rise of cities. For tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherer groups moved across these landscapes. Agriculture gradually transformed the region during the Neolithic period. Settlements expanded. Social hierarchies formed. There is no material evidence of a technologically advanced non-human species ruling cities before Sumer. No skeletal remains suggest an alternative humanoid lineage occupying Eridu for 30 millennia. The soil yields pottery, tools, foundations, but not the bones of immortal kings. And yet the absence of evidence is complicated by the passage of time. The last ice age ended roughly 11,700 years ago. Sea levels rose, submerging vast coastal plains where early human communities may have thrived. River courses shifted. Sediment accumulated. Entire chapters of habitation could lie beneath meters of silt or beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, which during lower sea levels would have been a broad, fertile basin. If there were earlier complex societies, human or otherwise, their traces might be obscured beyond easy recovery. This is not proof of their existence, but it tempers certainty. The king list presents its antediluvian rulers not as gods but as kings. They inhabit cities. They hold office. They reign and then they are succeeded. The language is administrative, almost clinical. There is no overt embellishment beyond the scale of time itself. This subtlety is striking. In myth, gods battle, shape mountains, command storms. In the king list, the early rulers simply rule, for astonishing durations, until the flood comes. The narrative restraint lends the text a peculiar gravity. It does not plead to be believed. It states, were these reign lengths a symbolic device to convey that the earliest age was fundamentally different from the present? A way of saying that the world before the flood operated under altered conditions, where time flowed differently, where proximity to the divine extended life beyond modern limits. Or do the numbers encode something lost to us, an archaic method of reckoning time, misunderstood in translation, or a memory of lineages so ancient that later scribes inflated them into mythic proportions? There is also a more unsettling possibility. In the deep past, Homo sapiens shared the planet with other hominin species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others left genetic traces within us. We know that coexistence occurred. We know that multiple human-like lineages once walked the earth. What if cultural memory, stretched and distorted across millennia, preserved a dim awareness of such coexistence? Not literal immortality but a recollection of others, different in stature, in strength, perhaps in cognition, who preceded or overlapped with early modern humans. The king list does not name them as non-human. It does not describe their physiology. It offers only time, vast, incomprehensible time, and the assertion that kingship originated beyond ordinary humanity. Between the lines of clay, ambiguity lingers. The ruins of Eridu remain silent under the Mesopotamian sun. Beneath layers of earth lie foundations that predate writing, predate kingship as recorded. Somewhere in those strata, the boundary between myth and memory blurs. The antediluvian kings stand at that boundary, figures suspended between allegory and possibility, ruling cities that archaeology confirms, for durations that biology denies. Whether they were symbols of cosmic order or distorted echoes of something once real, their presence in the earliest historical record is not accidental. They were written down, preserved, copied. Kings before humanity, or humanity remembering a time when it was not alone. The clay does not answer. It waits. In the shadowed chambers of Mesopotamian temples, carved into stone reliefs and impressed into clay, there appear figures that do not fully belong to the human world. They stand upright. They wear robes. They move among kings. And yet they are not entirely men. The texts call them apkallu, sages of a primordial age. In later Babylonian tradition, they are described as 7 in number, antediluvian counselors who served the earliest rulers before the Great Flood divided history. They are credited with bringing the arts of civilization, writing, law, ritual, architecture, agriculture. They are remembered not as conquerors but as teachers. Their knowledge was not learned. It was bestowed. In some accounts, the apkallu are said to have emerged from the Apsu, the deep freshwater abyss associated with the god Enki, lord of wisdom and subterranean waters. The sea becomes their threshold, the abyss their origin. In iconography preserved on Neo-Assyrian reliefs millennia later, figures identified as apkallu appear clad in fish skins, the head of the fish arching over the human face beneath. Others bear wings or carry ritual objects, a cone and bucket, as if engaged in purification rites. These are not crude monsters. They are composed, deliberate, poised between categories. To interpret them as purely symbolic is natural. The fish cloak may represent fertility, life emerging from water. The wings may signal divinity or transcendence. The cone and bucket may denote ritual purification. Ancient art often employed composite forms to express metaphysical ideas. And yet the consistency of their depiction across centuries invites closer attention. The apkallu are not distant gods enthroned in the sky. They stand beside kings. They advise. They instruct. They bridge realms. The Sumerian and later Akkadian texts describe them as mediators of knowledge, bearers of me, the divine decrees or principles that structure civilization itself. Writing, metalworking, temple rites, law, these are not portrayed as gradual human discoveries but as transmissions. The implication is profound. Civilization, in this telling, did not arise solely from human ingenuity. It was delivered. Alongside the apkallu appear the Anunnaki, a term that echoes through Mesopotamian literature with layered meanings. In early Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are divine beings associated with the highest levels of the pantheon. They are offspring of An, the sky god, and they participate in cosmic deliberations. They decree destinies. They shape the order of the world. But they are not always remote. In certain narratives, the Anunnaki walk among humanity. In the Atrahasis epic, they are divided between greater and lesser gods, the latter burdened with labor until humanity is fashioned to relieve them. In these accounts, the creation of humankind is not an isolated act of divine whim, but a response to exhaustion, to the practical demands of sustaining the cosmos. The language is mythological, yet it retains a peculiar texture. Humans are molded from clay mixed with the essence of a slain god. They are designed to serve, to cultivate the land, to maintain temples. The gods rest. The hierarchy stabilizes. Such stories have long been read as theological allegory, expressions of human dependence on nature and the divine. They articulate social realities through cosmic metaphor. Labor, hierarchy, mortality, all are encoded in narrative form. And yet the presence of intermediary beings, neither fully God nor fully human, complicates the picture. The apkallu in particular occupy a liminal space. They are sometimes described as partly human, partly fish. In later traditions after the flood, their successors are said to be fully human sages, inheritors of diluted wisdom. It is as though something was lost in the transition from the antediluvian world to the present one, a diminution of proximity to the divine. Were these beings purely symbolic constructs, or do they represent cultural memory refracted through sacred imagery? The human mind has always used hybrid forms to express complexity. Egyptian gods bear animal heads. Greek myths describe centaurs and satyrs. Such imagery does not demand literal interpretation. It encodes meaning in visual paradox. Yet the Mesopotamian case carries a distinctive emphasis on instruction. The apkallu are remembered not primarily for supernatural feats, but for pedagogy. They teach writing. They teach architecture. They teach ritual. The foundation of urban civilization is attributed to them. This motif appears repeatedly, as if the origin of knowledge required an external catalyst. In the archaeological record, the emergence of writing and complex urban systems appears rapid when viewed against the vast backdrop of prehistory. Within a few millennia, small agrarian communities evolve into stratified cities with monumental temples and administrative bureaucracy. The transition is documented in layers of mud brick and pottery shards, in irrigation canals and workshop debris. There is no clear evidence of non-human architects overseeing this transformation. No skeletal remains of fish-cloaked instructors have been unearthed. The development of complexity can be traced through incremental innovation, changes in tool design, in settlement patterns, in social organization. And yet cultural memory often compresses gradual change into singular events. A long arc of experimentation may be remembered as a gift from a single teacher. The abstraction of centuries can crystallize into a figure emerging from the sea. Still, the ambiguity persists. The depiction of Apkallu as amphibious beings emerging from water recalls a deeper evolutionary truth. Life itself arose from the sea. Humanity's distant ancestors once inhabited aquatic environments. Could the symbolism reflect an intuitive recognition of origins, mythologized into narrative form? Or is the resemblance coincidental, a poetic flourish rather than a biological echo? The Anunnaki, too, resist simple categorization. In some texts, they are celestial judges of the underworld. In others, they are active participants in shaping humanity's fate. They are described as powerful, radiant, sometimes fearsome, yet not wholly incomprehensible. They converse. They deliberate. They err. The boundary between deity and biological entity blurs. Ancient Mesopotamians did not separate the sacred from the material as modern thought tends to do. For them, divine presence permeated reality. To describe a being as a god was not necessarily to place it outside the natural order, but to situate it within a hierarchy of power and essence. If there were extraordinary individuals, leaders of unusual stature, strangers bearing unfamiliar knowledge, how would they have been remembered? As mere mortals? Or as beings touched by something beyond ordinary humanity? It is impossible to say with certainty. The texts endure, layered with centuries of interpretation. The reliefs remain, their hybrid figures carved in stone with meticulous care. They stand beside kings, whispering counsel across time. Teachers from the deep. Beings who bridged heaven and earth. Bringers of knowledge at the dawn of civilization. Whether they were metaphors for human genius or distorted memories of encounters now lost to history, their presence in the earliest written tradition is unmistakable. In the silence between clay lines and carved wings, the question lingers: who or what first taught humanity to write its own story? In the beginning, according to the ancient tablets, there was unrest. Before cities, before kings, before the measured cadence of human history, the cosmos itself was unsettled. The great gods presided over creation, but beneath them labored lesser divine beings, tasked with sustaining the machinery of existence. They dug canals. They maintained the order of earth and sky. They bore the burden of work. And they grew weary. In the Atrahasis epic, preserved in Akkadian tablets from the 2nd millennium BCE, the narrative opens not with humanity, but with divine complaint. The Igigi, subordinate gods assigned to toil, rebel against their superiors. They surround the dwelling of Enlil in protest, demanding relief from endless labor. This is not the language of abstract theology. It is the language of hierarchy, of structured obligation, of a system strained by imbalance. The solution, proposed by the god Enki, is radical. A new being will be fashioned. A creature molded from clay, animated with the essence of a slain deity. This being will assume the burden. It will dig canals, raise temples, cultivate fields. It will serve. Thus humanity is created, not as sovereign but as substitute. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, echoes this theme in different form. After Marduk defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat and establishes cosmic order, he resolves to create mankind. The blood of the rebel god Kingu is mixed with clay, and from this union humanity arises. I will create man, Marduk declares, that the service of the gods may be established. Service, labor, maintenance. The texts do not present humanity as the apex of creation, but as workforce. Why would gods require workers? If read symbolically, the answer reflects the social realities of ancient Mesopotamia. The temple economy depended on agricultural labor. Irrigation canals demanded constant upkeep. The gods, embodied in cult statues and housed in elaborate sanctuaries, required offerings. To serve the gods was to sustain society itself. The myth externalizes this structure into cosmic narrative. Yet the framing remains provocative. Before humanity there existed a functioning system. The gods had roles. There was hierarchy, administration, conflict resolution. There were decisions, rebellions, punishments. The cosmos resembled a state. This imagined pre-human order raises a question that reverberates beyond theology. What, in the Sumerian imagination, preceded us? The texts suggest continuity. The gods did not emerge with humanity, they predated it. They inhabited cities before humans did. In some traditions, Eridu is described as having been established in primordial times, long before the flood, under divine oversight. If this is allegory, it is remarkably consistent. Humanity's purpose is defined in relation to a pre-existing structure. We are inserted into an ongoing system. We inherit a world already organized, already governed. The clay from which humans are fashioned carries deeper resonance. Clay is the substance of Mesopotamian life. It forms bricks, seals tablets, shapes vessels. It is ubiquitous and malleable. To be made of clay is to be both humble and essential. But in these myths, clay is mixed with divine blood. Mortality fused with transcendence. The result is a hybrid species, earthly yet animated by something of the divine. Such imagery has often been interpreted as metaphor for human consciousness, for the capacity to reflect, to create, to suffer. But the narrative tension remains centered on labor. The gods require maintenance. Temples must be built. Offerings must be prepared. The burden must shift from divine shoulders to human hands. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, echoes of this origin persist. Gilgamesh himself is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a liminal figure whose strength and arrogance unsettle his city. The gods create Enkidu as a counterbalance, shaping him from clay in the wilderness. Again, the motif of formation recurs. Humanity is crafted with purpose. But beneath the poetic surface lies a structural question. If the lesser gods once dug canals and maintained the earth, what does that imply about the world before humanity? Was it imagined as a literal landscape requiring physical upkeep? Or does the narrative encode a memory of transition, from one mode of existence to another? Some have proposed that these myths preserve the psychological memory of a shift from nomadic life to agricultural labor. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived as foragers. The Neolithic Revolution bound them to fields and irrigation systems. Labor intensified. Social hierarchies hardened. The myth of divine rebellion and human creation may reflect that transformation, a reframing of newfound toil as cosmic destiny. Yet even this explanation leaves space for ambiguity. The texts do not describe gradual adaptation. They describe design, deliberation, intentional creation in response to crisis. The Igigi revolt. The divine council convenes. A decision is made. Humanity is engineered as solution. Engineered. The language of mixture, clay and divine blood, suggests synthesis. The infusion of essence. A transfer of burden and perhaps of knowledge. If the gods represent forces of nature, then humanity becomes the mediator between chaos and order, tasked with sustaining balance. But if the gods once walked the earth in more tangible form, as the myths often imply, then the creation narrative reads differently. It suggests replacement, substitution. The arrival of a new species to assume control of infrastructure once managed by others. There is no archaeological evidence of divine laborers abandoning canals. Irrigation systems appear in the record as human achievements, evolving through trial and error. The rise of cities is traceable through material remains, not sudden divine withdrawal. And yet myths often condense complex processes into singular events. 1,000 years of incremental change may crystallize into a moment of creation. Still, the insistence on purpose remains. Humanity is not accidental in these texts. It is crafted to fulfill a role within a pre-existing order. That order is hierarchical, structured, and ancient. The gods debate, enforce, and destroy. When humanity multiplies too quickly, disturbing divine rest with noise, the flood is sent as corrective measure. Population control through catastrophe. The cycle repeats: creation, service, disruption, destruction. In this framework, humans are both indispensable and expendable. Such narratives invite reflection not only on ancient belief, but on how early civilizations understood themselves. To conceive of humanity as laborer for higher powers is to accept limitation, to frame existence within obligation. It is also to acknowledge dependence on forces beyond comprehension. Whether the gods of these texts were ever imagined as biological entities or always as metaphysical principles remains a matter of interpretation. The tablets do not clarify. They record. In the dim light of temple archives, scribes impressed these stories into clay, preserving a worldview in which humanity's origin was neither random nor triumphant. We were shaped in response to conflict, assigned a task, inserted into a cosmos already in motion. Before us there was a system. After us there was toil. And somewhere within that ancient equation lies the enduring question. If we were created to serve, who, or what, first required our service? The waters rise without warning. In the ancient Mesopotamian imagination, the sky darkens, the wind howls, and the earth trembles beneath unrelenting rain. Rivers swell beyond their banks. Cities vanish beneath churning currents. The boundary between land and sea dissolves. In the span of days, the world that was carefully ordered returns to chaos. The flood is not a minor calamity. It is a rupture in time. In the Sumerian tradition, the tale appears first in the story of Ziusidra, a righteous king warned by a god to build a vessel and preserve life. In the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the narrative deepens. Humanity has multiplied, its noise disturbing the gods. A decision is made in divine council. The flood will cleanse the earth. Only one man, instructed in secret, survives with his family and animals. Later still, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim recounts the same catastrophe to a grieving king seeking immortality. The details shift, but the structure remains. A chosen survivor. A constructed ark. A deluge that annihilates all others. The king list reinforces this boundary. 8 antediluvian kings reign for impossible spans. Then the flood sweeps over the land. Afterward, kingship descends again, and history resumes under altered conditions. The narrative is clear. Before the flood, one world. After the flood, another. For centuries, such accounts were regarded as mythic archetypes, moral dramas illustrating divine displeasure and human fragility. Flood stories appear across cultures. From Mesopotamia to the Levant, from Greece to India, from the Americas to East Asia. The universality of the motif suggested psychological symbolism. Water as chaos, purification, rebirth. Yet in the 19th and 20th centuries, geology began to complicate that interpretation. The end of the last ice age, approximately 11,700 years ago, marked a dramatic shift in climate. Vast ice sheets melted. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over millennia. Coastlines that had once extended far beyond their present limits disappeared beneath advancing waters. River systems altered course. Low-lying plains flooded. The Persian Gulf, now a shallow body of water, was once a broad basin fed by the Tigris and Euphrates. During periods of lower sea level, it would have formed a fertile landscape capable of sustaining human communities. As the seas rose, that landscape would have been inundated. If settlements existed there, they are now submerged beyond easy reach. Within Mesopotamia itself, sediment cores reveal layers of flood deposits in certain sites, suggesting episodes of severe inundation in antiquity. At Shuruppak and other early cities, archaeologists have identified strata consistent with major flooding events around the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BCE. These were not global deluges, but they were devastating on a regional scale. Could such events have seeded the flood narratives preserved in clay? It is plausible. A catastrophic river flood in a densely populated plain would leave deep cultural scars. Survivors would recount the destruction. Generations later, the memory might expand, magnified into cosmic judgment. A regional disaster could become universal in story. And yet the flood in Mesopotamian texts does more than destroy cities. It resets kingship. It truncates reign lengths. It marks the end of antediluvian time. Before the flood, rulers governed for tens of thousands of years. After it, lifespans contract to recognizable human scales. The rupture is biological as well as political. If the antediluvian kings are symbolic, perhaps the flood represents the end of mythic time, the beginning of historical consciousness. An allegorical dawn. But another possibility lingers. Human prehistory extends far beyond the rise of cities. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens inhabited diverse environments, developing languages, art, and social structures. We now know that we were not alone. Other hominin species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, coexisted with us for millennia before disappearing from the fossil record. Their extinction was not marked by written testimony. It is inferred from bones and DNA. Could the flood myth encode, in distorted form, a much older memory of upheaval? Not necessarily a literal wall of water, but a period of climatic instability, of ecological collapse, of population bottlenecks that reshaped humanity itself? The Younger Dryas period, beginning roughly 12,900 years ago, brought abrupt cooling and environmental stress to many regions. Megafauna vanished. Human groups adapted or migrated. While no evidence links this directly to a single global flood, the era underscores how swiftly conditions can change, how vulnerable societies are to environmental shock. Myths often compress centuries into moments. They translate complex processes into vivid images. The flood becomes a symbol for extinction, for reset. Yet the Mesopotamian narrative insists on specificity. The gods convene. The decision is made. The ark is built to precise dimensions. Birds are released to test for dry land. These details convey memory as much as metaphor. Moreover, the flood divides two eras described in the King list, an age of extraordinary rulers and an age of diminished humanity. It functions almost as a biological demarcation. Were the antediluvian figures imagined as fundamentally different beings? If so, the flood becomes not only punishment but eradication, an extinction event embedded in myth. There is no archaeological evidence of a technologically advanced pre-flood civilization buried beneath Mesopotamian sediments. No ruins of impossible antiquity have surfaced to confirm a lost world of immortal kings. The material record supports gradual development, not sudden obliteration of a global empire. And yet absence is not resolution. Large portions of early human habitation were coastal. As sea levels rose, entire regions disappeared. Underwater archaeology remains in its infancy compared to terrestrial excavation. The possibility that early complex communities existed in now submerged landscapes cannot be dismissed outright, though neither can it be affirmed without evidence. The flood narrative endures because it resonates. It captures a universal anxiety, the fragility of order, the ever-present threat of chaos. But in Mesopotamia, it also serves as hinge between two modes of existence. Before the waters, kings rule for millennia. After the waters, time contracts. The world feels smaller, more mortal. Was this simply theological framing, a way to explain why human life is brief and precarious? Or does it preserve a dim recollection of a profound transition, environmental, biological, or cultural, that severed humanity from something that came before? The tablets do not speculate. They recount. Rain falls. Cities drown. One man survives to tell the tale. When the waters recede, he offers sacrifice. The gods gather like flies over the offering, hungry, regretful. A covenant is implied. The cycle of total annihilation will not repeat so easily. But the world that emerges is not the same as the one that was lost. In the quiet after catastrophe, humanity begins again, short-lived, burdened, mortal. And somewhere beneath the sediment of myth and silt, the memory of what was erased remains suspended, waiting to be understood. Empires do not inherit stories unchanged. They reshape them. As centuries passed and Sumer city-states gave way to new powers, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, the old tablets did not vanish. They were copied, translated, absorbed into evolving traditions. But in the act of preservation, something subtle occurred. The past was not erased. It was reinterpreted. When Sargon of Akkad forged one of the first territorial empires in the 3rd millennium BCE, he did not discard Sumerian culture. He appropriated it. He adopted its gods, its writing system, its administrative structures. The sacred narratives of Sumer were carried forward into Akkadian language, reshaped through new political lenses. Myths once rooted in local cult centers were woven into imperial theology. The gods themselves were reorganized. In early Sumerian tradition, power was distributed among a network of deities, and Enlil, Enki, Inanna, each presiding over domains of sky, wind, wisdom, love, and war. Authority was diffuse, negotiated in divine assemblies. But as Babylon rose to prominence, a theological consolidation emerged. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk, patron god of Babylon, is elevated above all others. He defeats primordial chaos, restructures the cosmos, and assumes supreme authority. The narrative is not merely theological. It is political. By placing Marduk at the center of creation, Babylon positioned itself at the center of divine order. Earlier myths were not discarded. They were reframed to serve new hierarchies. Tiamat, once a primordial force, becomes adversary. Kingu's blood becomes ingredient for humanity. The cosmic drama mirrors imperial ambition. In this process of reinterpretation, the memory of earlier ages shifts tone. The antediluvian kings remain in the king list, but their impossibly long reigns become relics of distant antiquity, less emphasized than the dynasties that follow. The Apkallu, once primordial sages, are transformed in later tradition into semi-mythical figures whose knowledge is partially lost. Their liminal nature becomes stylized iconography, carved on palace walls as protective symbols rather than historical actors. What was once narrative may become emblem. Assyrian kings, ruling from cities like Nineveh and Ashur, commissioned reliefs that depicted winged genii, figures scholars often associate with Apkallu, standing beside the sovereign, performing rituals of purification. These beings are no longer central characters in cosmic origin stories. They are guardians, attendants, embodiments of divine sanction. Their earlier context recedes. As theology evolves, so too does memory. The flood narrative, for instance, is retained, but its emphasis shifts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story becomes a meditation on mortality rather than a political boundary between eras. Utnapishtim's survival is less about resetting kingship and more about the limits of human life. The catastrophe transforms from cosmic purge to existential lesson. Each retelling filters the past through contemporary concerns. This is not deception. It is adaptation. Religious systems within Mesopotamia were never static. They absorbed influences from neighboring cultures. They responded to conquest, to economic change, to social upheaval. Temples rose and fell. Patron deities waxed and waned. With each transition, older narratives were copied by scribes who lived in different worlds from the authors of the originals. Scribes were guardians of tradition, but also interpreters. When they copied a text centuries old, they sometimes modernized language, clarified obscure phrases, harmonized contradictions. In doing so, they subtly mediated between eras. The clay tablets we possess are often copies of copies, filtered through layers of transmission. If there were elements within early myths that later generations found uncomfortable, suggestions of non-human rulers, of gods who labored, of a world fundamentally different from their own, they might not have been erased outright. They might have been reframed as allegory. It is easier to preserve a troubling narrative when it is symbolic. The notion that kingship descended from heaven, for example, remains intact across centuries. But its meaning shifts. In early Sumer, it may have conveyed a mysterious transfer of authority from a divine realm into a fragile human society. In later empires, it becomes formulaic rhetoric, a legitimizing phrase inscribed on monuments to reinforce royal power. The words endure. The resonance changes. Similarly, the creation of humanity as laborer for the gods persists in epic tradition. Yet as temple economies evolved and imperial structures grew more complex, the emphasis on divine exhaustion and rebellion fades. The gods become more distant, more abstract, less anthropomorphic in their needs. Humanity's servitude becomes ritual obligation rather than literal substitution for divine workers. The older tension softens. One might ask whether the evolution of theology gradually obscured earlier layers of meaning. Did later priests and scribes fully comprehend the archaic narratives they transmitted? Or did they, too, inherit fragments whose original context had already begun to fade? By the first millennium BCE, Mesopotamian scholarship had become highly sophisticated. Scholars compiled lexical lists, commentaries, and omen texts. They studied ancient compositions with reverence, yet also with analytical distance. The past was both sacred and remote. In such an environment, myth could become canon without remaining literal. The Apkallu, once perhaps envisioned as active participants in primordial history, were reinterpreted as archetypal sages. The Anunnaki, once dynamic actors in cosmic drama, became fixed members of a pantheon whose functions were increasingly systematized. The antediluvian kings receded into the category of legendary antiquity, their reigns accepted as part of a sacred narrative without necessarily demanding empirical belief. Political necessity and religious development intertwined. Empires require continuity. They root themselves in antiquity to claim legitimacy. But they also require coherence. Narratives that threaten coherence, suggesting radical discontinuity or unsettling origins, are often subsumed into metaphor. And yet the older layers never fully disappear. The king list remains intact, its impossible reigns preserved. The flood continues to divide eras. The creation of humanity from clay and divine essence is still recited. The hybrid figures endure in art and text. Erased? Not entirely. Rewritten? Certainly. Forgotten? Perhaps only partially. What lingers is a palimpsest, stories written over older stories, each layer visible beneath the next. The political ambitions of Babylon do not entirely efface the memory of Sumer. Assyrian reinterpretation does not obliterate Akkadian tradition. Instead, the myths accumulate strata like the cities themselves. Somewhere within those strata may lie traces of narratives that once carried sharper implications, of beings before us, of systems predating humanity, of catastrophes that severed epochs. As theology matured, these implications may have been absorbed into safer frameworks, rendered symbolic rather than historical. But clay is patient. Even when reinterpreted, the original impressions remain. And beneath imperial rhetoric and evolving doctrine, the faint outlines of earlier mysteries persist, waiting for careful eyes to discern where interpretation ends and memory begins. For centuries the debate belonged to myth. But now science has entered the silence. In sterile laboratories and wind-scoured excavation sites, fragments of bone have begun to speak. A curved brow ridge emerging from sediment. A finger bone discovered in a Siberian cave. A skull unearthed from a remote Indonesian island. Each discovery a quiet disruption of certainty. Paleoanthropology, once confident in a simple lineage, has revealed something far more intricate. We were not alone in our becoming. In 1856, laborers in Germany's Neander Valley uncovered bones that did not quite resemble their own. Heavy, robust, ancient. The species would be named after the place of its discovery, Homo neanderthalensis. For decades, it was portrayed as brutish and dim, an evolutionary dead end. But time reshaped that portrait. Neanderthals buried their dead. They crafted tools with deliberate precision. They adorned themselves with pigments and perhaps ornaments. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger. And most unsettling of all, genetic analysis has shown that many modern humans carry traces of Neanderthal DNA. Our ancestors did not merely replace them. They met them. They touched them. They shared bloodlines. And Neanderthals were not the only shadow. In 2008, deep within the Denisova cave in the Altai Mountains, researchers uncovered a fragment of a child's finger bone so small it might have been dismissed as insignificant. Yet its DNA revealed an entirely unknown lineage. A new name entered the record, Denisovans. They left no complete skeletons, no clear faces to reconstruct. Only genetic echoes, woven into the genomes of people across parts of Asia and Oceania. A ghost population. Present yet invisible. And farther south, on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists uncovered diminutive skeletons barely over a meter tall. They were designated Homo floresiensis. Their small bodies and tiny skulls defied expectation. How could such a being survive so late in human prehistory? They lived until roughly 50,000 years ago, overlapping with the arrival of modern humans in the region. The timeline grows crowded. For most of the last 300,000 years, Earth was not inhabited by a single human species, but by several. Homo sapiens walked landscapes shared with other minds capable of craft, adaptation, perhaps even imagination. What did they see when they saw one another? Science reconstructs bones and genes. It charts migration routes. It measures isotopes in enamel and counts mutations in DNA. From these data, a portrait emerges: interbreeding events, periods of coexistence, gradual disappearance. Mainstream scholars interpret the record through evolutionary logic. Species diverge. They compete. They merge. They vanish. The myths of ancient cultures, tales of giants, forest beings, underground dwellers, are understood as symbolic language. Archetypes born of the human psyche. Metaphors for fear of the unknown. Allegories shaped by memory's distortions. In this view, the stories are poetry, not testimony. Yet not all are satisfied with so clean a separation. Some researchers, working at the margins of academic acceptance, ask a different question. What if fragments of these encounters survived not only in our DNA but in narrative? What if myths encode dim recollections of real meetings between distinct human species? They point to recurring motifs across continents, accounts of powerful beings inhabiting mountains and caves, described as similar yet different. Tales of small, elusive forest people. Stories of unions between others and ancestors, producing hybrid offspring. Are these coincidences of imagination? Or echoes of a shared prehistory? The scientific establishment urges caution. Oral traditions evolve. Human cultures independently generate similar symbols. The mind is adept at pattern making even when patterns do not exist. To interpret myth as literal memory risks collapsing scholarship into speculation. And yet, the boundaries are not as firm as once believed. Genetics has already revealed what would have sounded implausible a century ago. modern humans are hybrids. In certain populations, up to 2% of the genome derives from Neanderthals. In others, Denisovan ancestry contributes to immune systems and high-altitude adaptation. The past is not a clean succession but a braided river. If physical interbreeding occurred, interaction must have preceded it. Communication of some kind. Recognition. Perhaps even cultural exchange. Could early Homo sapiens have perceived their cousins as something other? Not entirely animal. Not entirely familiar. A neighboring tribe, or a different kind of being. No written record survives from those encounters. No cave painting clearly depicts a meeting between species with labeled certainty. What we have are ambiguous forms. Hybrid creatures etched into stone, figures with exaggerated proportions, beings emerging from darkness. Archaeology demands restraint. Imagination demands meaning. Between them lies tension. Science continues to push deeper. Advances in ancient DNA extraction allow researchers to reconstruct entire genomes from microscopic fragments. Sediment itself can yield genetic traces of species long vanished. The fossil record grows less silent with each passing decade. Yet the more we discover, the more complex the story becomes. We once imagined a ladder of progress, primitive to advanced, archaic to modern. Now we see a tangled web. Coexistence. Overlap. Disappearance not as sudden annihilation but as absorption, decline, or isolation. And still, one question lingers beneath the data. Why did only one lineage endure? Was it climate adaptability? Social complexity? Language? Chance? Or something more subtle? An advantage invisible in bone and gene alike? The alternative researchers suggest a different framing. Perhaps what we call myth was never intended as literal chronicle, but neither was it pure invention. Perhaps ancient storytellers preserved, in symbolic form, the memory of a time when the world felt more populated with human-like others. Not gods descending from the sky but neighbors in the valley. Not spirits of the forest but flesh and blood. If that were so, then myth and science are not adversaries but overlapping maps, one written in metaphor, the other in molecules. Yet caution remains essential. The leap from fossil to folklore is vast. To bridge it without evidence risks distorting both. The field stands at a crossroads of interpretation. On one side, rigorous empiricism, wary of narrative seduction. On the other, an openness to the possibility that human memory, transmitted through story, may reach farther back than we assume. The tension does not resolve. In laboratories lit by fluorescence, geneticists decode sequences that once pulsed through ancient veins. In archives and oral histories, scholars trace recurring figures whose origins vanish into prehistory. Between them stretches a question that refuses easy closure. We now know that our ancestors walked among other human species. That they met. That they mingled. That some vanished while others endured. What remains uncertain is how those meetings felt. Were they encounters of curiosity? Of fear? Of violence? Of alliance? Science can measure the fragments that survived in bone and blood. But the emotional landscape of those first meetings, the awe of seeing a mind almost like one's own, yet unmistakably different, remains beyond recovery. Or perhaps not entirely. In the convergence of fossil evidence and persistent mythic forms, a possibility flickers. Not proof. Not confirmation. But suggestion. The story of humanity may be less solitary than we once believed. And the line between memory and myth may be thinner than stone.